Okay, good evening, everybody. We're going to get started. First of all, welcome to this evening's webinar. My name is Michael O'Connor, for those of you who don't know me. I'm a lawyer with a very keen interest in legal history, the history of crime and punishment, and also public institutions in Georgian and Victorian Ireland, and in particular in rural Georgian and Victorian Ireland. 3 years ago, I started to look in detail and conduct research into the many jails and prisons in County Mayo. And in September of last year, I published the first part of my study. You might ask, how do you get from looking at that to sitting here tonight talking to you about abuse and misconduct at Castlebar Workhouse in the 1860s? And the answer is very simple. I've been taken to this place tonight by two women, B.D. Cunningham and Ellen Burke. Some 2.5 years ago, at the beginning of my work on the prisons, I encountered both of these women in the boardroom of the jail on the Westport Road in Castlebar. And they were giving evidence at a poor law inquiry. And they were subjected to exceptionally aggressive interrogation and cross-examination by John Bold, one of the poor law guardians in Castlebar, and also by Benjamin Brodie, the man who was heading up the inquiry. And their story caught my imagination. And unlike a lot of the unfortunates that I would have come across in the context of the prison research, these two women, I was unable to put them into my archive and file them away because they kept popping up every now and again, almost checking to see how I was getting on with my research into what had happened to them all that time ago. So there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of evidence and cross-examination, a lot of parties. So what I want to do tonight is distill it all down and present you with the bare bones of an overview of what happened at Castlebar Workhouse in the early 1860s. My plan later in this year is to publish a detailed paper around this, and I will also leave you with a copy of the slides, which I'll post on the Mayo History and Heritage page over the next few days. So the first slide is an ordnance survey map of Castlebar from the 1890s, and if you look to the top left, you'll see Castlebar Union Workhouse. Then on the outskirts of the town is now extended in that direction, and the site is today occupied by the county home, the workhouse having been demolished in the late 1960s. I've failed to find a photograph of Castlebar Workhouse. This one is from the Irish Independent from December 1967. At the time, the workhouse was either in the process of being demolished or possibly slightly before the demolition commenced. It's not a particularly good photograph, but in some ways it does capture, for me anyway, or it conveys a feeling or an impression of the place as it was in the 19th and early 20th century. The Castlebar Workhouse opened in 1842. It was built under the Poor Relief Ireland Act of 1838 and had a capacity to accommodate 700 persons. There was separate accommodation for males and females and adults and children. And then there was also a kitchen, washrooms, stores, infirmary, laundry, and chapel. And in the context of tonight's discussions, there were separation wards, also known as reformatories or refractory wards for men and women. Outside, there was a cemetery where paupers who died within the workhouse were buried. The workhouse was subject to a lot of controversy and criticism during the famine years. And in the winter of 1846, 1847, the Guardians closed the workhouse to the poor. Those left inside many of them died from starvation, from the cold, and from disease. We'll return to that in a couple of moments. This is not specifically Castlebar Workhouse. It's a ground floor plan that is available on the UCD Cultural Heritage Collections site. It's from a Poor Law Commissioner's report from the 19th century, and it shows it's a template for workhouses and how they were to be built. But you can't see the detail of the different labels for the different spaces on the screen. But if you look at the layout plan on the UCD page, and there are many other layout plans that are very useful, you'll see the different divisions, the separation yards, separate yards for men and women, separate accommodation for men and women, separate accommodation for children, and then all of the other elements of the workhouse that I mentioned a moment ago. I've not been able to determine where the reformatory wards would have been. They would not have been large. Perhaps they will reveal themselves at some time in the future, but right now it's not entirely obvious to me where they might have been. So this gentleman is George Charles Bingham, 3rd Earl of Lucan, the man who laid the foundation stone for the workhouse in the early 1840s. He was subjected to sustained criticism when the workhouse was closed in 1846, 1847, and later when he evicted thousands of people from his estates around Ballinrobe and Castlebar, and those people ultimately made their way to the workhouses in Ballinrobe and in Castlebar. This slide, it's an overview of the regulation and governance of the workhouses. So these workhouses were established under the Poor Relief Act 1838. The Act set up poor law commissioners to implement the legislation, to get the workhouses built, etc. Underneath the poor law commissioners, there was a board of guardians. These were elected in each of the unions, the union being a collection of townlands. Beneath the board of guardians, there was a visiting committee, and their remit was governed by the workhouse rules. There was a parish warden whose job it was to convey the destitute to the workhouse. The overall control and day-to-day running of the workhouse was vested in a workhouse master, and the details of his obligations and responsibilities are set out in the Act and also in the workhouse rules themselves. Underneath the master, there was a matron. Again, the Act sets out her role and responsibilities, and she was primarily responsible for female inmates and also for the young children. The Act provided for the appointment of a medical officer who was paid, and clergy of the Roman Catholic, Protestant and Protestant dissenting faiths. The schoolmistress had an important role with respect to education, but also with respect to discipline. And finally, there was the porter, who somewhat surprisingly features quite a bit in the investigations and in the litigation that followed them, but more about that later on. So I've given you a link there, which you can look at again when I circulate the slides, to the 1844 version of the workhouse rules. And this is a comprehensive set of rules covering all aspects of life in the workhouse, from admission to release, escape, or death, and everything in between. They deal with dietary, they deal with medical issues, aspects, the infirmary, classification of paupers into different classes, and importantly, they also deal with punishment, including public punishment and confinement in the reformatories. The rules give considerable latitude to the master and the mistress, and the master and mistress were accountable to the guardians and also to the commissioners. The legislation also established a number of specific criminal offences, including absconding from the workhouse, insubordination and disobedience. And these three in particular feature quite heavily in the investigations that we're going to look at in a few minutes. The rules also provided for a punishment book that the minister was supposed to keep, and every time he or the matron doled out some punishment, it was necessary to record it in that book, and the book could be reviewed by the guardians. in the 1863, in the context of a legal action in Castlebar Courthouse, the magistrate Andrew Stritch demanded that the punishment book for Castlebar Workhouse be produced. Counsel for the master, Patrick Callahan, went to great lengths to ensure that it was not produced, fear being either that the punishment in question was not recorded, in which case the master would have been guilty of breach of the rules, or probably of more concern for the master and his counsel was that the entry in the punishment book might have betrayed too much and would have helped in the prosecution that he was subjected to for assault. There was an obligation on the master to keep various registers, and one of the things that I'm trying to do is to gather together a register of registers that would identify what registers were kept in the workhouses in Mayo, what ones have survived, and importantly, where they are now, and whether it's possible to get access to them. But that's a story for another day. Well, the reformatory. So these were separate locked wards for men and women who were guilty of what was described as refractory behaviour. So they were refractory paupers. The definition was very broad. It included insubordination, disobedience, obscene behaviour, striking individuals, etc. And the reformatory was very much seen as being, had a dual purpose of punishment, but also reform. The women that we will be looking at tonight, they were in the reformatory for reasons almost exclusively to do with insubordination and disobedience, breach of workhouse rules. The master had the ability to commit them for 12 hours without recourse to anyone. If he wanted to extend it, then he had to go to the guardians. And in the case of some of the women, and two in particular, these extensions were granted and the women were contained in the reformatory for months at a time. Again, more about that later. The reformatory, the rules governing the reformatory were set out in the workhouse rules. The reformatory was intended to be a stark, bare and forbidding place, not the kind of place you wanted to go to, and if you were there, you certainly wanted to get out of there as quickly as you possibly could. There were no wardswomen in the female reformatory, and the women were basically left to fend for themselves. There was limited communication, and the master and the matron were able to control food and water. And there are instances where water was withheld, and the women were forced to drink from puddles on the floor of the reformatory. Inmate Ellen Burke gives some terrible testimony about the loneliness and isolation of being in the reformatory for long periods of time, where you would not see other people, communication would be very limited, and to the extent there was communication, it was through windows or through locked doors. So this is just a list of those who served as guardians in the period 1860-1863. There may have been others. They didn't all serve at the same time. They were subject to re-election on an annual basis. The individuals on the list that are noteworthy are John Bull. He was probably the most active guardian in Castlebar at that time, attended all of the meetings, was very active in attending the workhouse. Bull was the owner and editor of the Mayo Constitution newspaper, and he was also the nephew of the matron of the workhouse, a lady called Mary McClare. The other person worth mentioning is George Charles Bingham, Earl of Lucan. Unlike Bull, he rarely attended meetings. In fact, in this period, I could only find one meeting where he did attend, but his presence, even if he wasn't there, his presence was always felt, and his view was always put forward by people like Sir Samuel O'Malley or possibly also Edward Cannon. Others who are worthy of mention at this stage are Hugh Brown. Very much took the position of the master and matron at the workhouse. Brown was also a magistrate, and that's something we will touch on later on. as was Charles Lionel Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was probably the voice of reason and the person who brought some air of practicality to meetings of the Guardians. So officers and staff in the period 1861 to 63 who feature in the investigations. 5 people in particular. Anthony French, although he had left the workhouse by 1861, French became master in 1858, and he was the 10th at least master since the workhouse was set up in 1842. The Guardians found it impossible to hold on to masters. They died, they left, they disappeared, they were sacked, they resigned. So French joined in 1858, and the Guardians quickly formed a view that he was not a suitable person to be a master. There was a general view that he was an honest individual, but the majority of the Guardians were very much of the view that he was not effective, and that it was his lack of effectiveness that resulted in a spirit of insubordination and rebellion growing in the workhouse in the late 1850s into 1861 and 1862. So for a whole lot of reasons I won't get into, they managed to move Anthony French on and bring in Patrick Callahan. And Patrick Callahan was certainly everything that Anthony French was not, and in the eyes of the Guardians in particular, he was a very effective master. Callahan had served in Swinford Workhouse for 4 years before he came to Castlebar. I've not been able to determine how old he was, but he cannot have been that old if you bear in mind that he was master up until July 1900 when he died in the workhouse in his 60s. So he secured the position at Castlebar at quite a young age. The matron at the time was Mary McClare, John Bowles' aunt. John Carter Barrett was a medical officer, and Barrett had a very successful medical practice on Ellison Street. He was a medical officer to the workhouse for 15 years. He also was the dispensary officer in Castlebar, another salaried position. He was a married man and had a number of daughters. John Heaney was the Catholic clergyman in the workhouse at that time. And then there was a host of others who, in one way or another, had a role to play in the inquiries that followed, either because they were witnesses for the women or witnesses for the officers, or just because they were mentioned in dispatches. So who were the women in the reformatory? This is a list. They weren't all there at the same time. There were others, but these are the women who were involved in the inquiries and the litigation that followed, and 4 of them are worth focusing on and looking at their backgrounds in a little bit of detail. But in reality, the women were all very similar. They all had very similar backgrounds. They all endured and suffered the consequences of being left behind by the famine, left behind by partners, left behind by society. They were subjected to violence and abuse. They were tough characters. They were angry characters, and all in all, they cut a pretty desperate lot. But looking at 4 of them very quickly, we have Biddy Cunningham, age 45. Husband abandoned her before the famine. She turned to prostitution because she had no choice. She spent 17 or 18 years in the workhouse. It wasn't a continuous 17 or 18 years. There were periods. She had at least 2 lengthy periods in the reformatory. 12 months with the Sisters of Mercy in Galway. She left them, returned to Castlebar with a terrible chest infection, and Matron Mulclare incarcerated her in the reformatory. She was jailed 3 times between 1858 and when these inquiries started, and she deliberately committed petty crimes as a means of escaping from the reformatory. So if the reformatory door was open, she would run. She would grab a number of blankets, run from the workhouse, hand herself over to the constables, and then get taken to the prison on the Westward Road, wait for the petty sessions, get convicted, get sentenced to a month in prison, get released, and then the cycle would start all over. Ellen Burke was very much the same, but I think if you were to pick out one character that the guardians, or that a majority of the guardians and the officers at the workhouse really wanted to suppress and put down and contain and frankly shut up, it was Ellen Burke. She was abandoned by her husband. He was a Protestant. He went to Dublin. She followed him to Dublin. He denied the marriage because it had been celebrated by a Catholic priest. She walked back to Castlebar, stopping in workhouses on the way, turned to prostitution. Into the workhouse in March 1858. Her sister was there at that time. She was imprisoned on 13 separate occasions for petty crimes. Most of them were workhouse related, stealing blankets, breaking the odd window at the workhouse, that kind of thing. And most of them were very much a response to the way she was being treated in the workhouse. Bizarrely, notwithstanding the view the matron had of her, she was on occasion allowed to work in the laundry as a wardswoman, and that was contemplated by the rules of the workhouse, so there was nothing unusual about it. She spent lengthy periods in the reformatory, and her testimony as to what it was like is probably the best that we have available to us. She committed crimes to escape the reformatory, like Cunningham, but there was a particular issue relevant to Ellen Burke that was not relevant to the other parties, and that was that she had a very bad relationship with John Bowl. And I've worked hard to try and find out what the cause of that was. And I believe the cause of it was that Ellen Burke never denied that she had been in the past a prostitute, but she was very firmly of the view that she was a reformed woman in the early 1860s. She'd given it up, and that she had, I suppose, found her position in society again, albeit it was well down on the rungs of the ladder. She believed that she was a reformed person. Bull went to the workhouse and openly referred to Ellen Burke as having been on the mall. And in Castlebar, that was a euphemism for prostitution. A woman who was on the mall was a prostitute. And Ellen Burke became extremely angry, agitated, and upset about this. And before these inquiries started, she stole some blankets in the workhouse, ran away, handed herself into the constables, and while 5 constables were marching her to the prison, they were unaware that she had a large rock in her right hand. And as she passed the office of the Mail Constitution on Ellison Street, she'd seen John Bull in the window inside. She took aim with the missile and dispatched it in Bull's direction and screamed, "Take that, you Orangeman." The rock broke the window, missed Bull, and the offence was added to Ellen Burke's charge sheet. Mary Howard, 50 to 55 years of age. Her age is really important in the context of the inquiries. When she registered to enter the workhouse, she said she was 50. During the inquiries, she said she was approaching her 56th birthday. We'll come back to the relevance of that later. She suffered from curvature of the spine. Her soldier husband had died. He spent 4 years on the streets of Castlebar. Again, she turned to prostitution. She had 2 adult children. The eldest was 21, living in Dublin. So that perhaps gives us a little bit of an indication of what age she actually was. In her evidence, she said she had 2 illegitimate children. According to John Bowl, she had at least 4. Convictions for larceny, destruction of workhouse property. In the winter of 1862, she was given the role of a nurse in a fever hospital, and that really was the start of the first of the inquiries that would follow. Finally, Mary Kilcoyne, a witness in the second inquiry. Briefly, her life story was she entered service at a young age, very much wanted to get married. That didn't work out for her. 1861, she returned from England with someone who I think was probably her own age, someone called Pat Corcoran. She denied any relationship with Corcoran, and they were admitted to the workhouse at the same time and later expelled, possibly because of a suggestion that there was a relationship between the two of them and they weren't married. She worked in the laundry, spent time in the reformatory. At one point took a complaint to the Guardians against the schoolmistress, Anne Shannon, accusing her of stealing workout union property in the workhouse. I think that complaint was probably an act of revenge for her expulsion from the workhouse. Mary Kilcoyne was an exceptionally strong witness compared to the others. She was articulate, she was engaging, she was very able to answer questions put to her by John Bowl and others. And unlike the others, she had a good handle on facts, on details, on names, and importantly, on dates. So just a few points on the bigger picture before we get into the inquiries. So as I said, there were quite a number of masters at the workhouse in the period up to the late 1850s. The Guardians had taken the view, and also I think the Poor Law Commissioners in Dublin had taken the view that there was a spirit of insubordination at Castlebar Workhouse, that there was, you know, if not actual rebellion, there was an air of rebellion about the place. There was religious tension, the same as all of the public institutions. The Catholic versus Protestant thing was kind of worked out because you had a Catholic minister, a Protestant minister, and a Protestant dissenting minister. But in the decade leading up to the early 1860s, the Sisters of Mercy were working hard to get a foothold in the workhouse. And the Protestant cleric, the Reverend Stoney, was very much against that. And in the early 1860s, he found himself in a situation where a majority of the Board of the Guardians, including people like John Bowl, were minded to admit the Sisters of Mercy. Stoney responded in two ways. Firstly, he started writing letters to the Guardians outlining things that he believed these nuns were doing in other workhouses, and he wanted them investigated. Those letters were dismissed by the Guardians, returned to Stoney, and he was censured. He then started bringing Protestant inmates from Castlebar Workhouse before the Guardians, and they were making complaints about the treatment they were receiving at the hands of Catholic paupers in Castlebar Workhouse. In one case, a gentleman by the name of, I think, William Vizard, who was said to be 99 years of age, complained that the schoolboys had brought a donkey or an ass into the workhouse, and they were using him as a fence for this donkey to jump. The Guardians did investigate that complaint and a couple of others, but overall they took the view that a lot of the complaints were fabricated by Stoney as a means to counter the arrival of the Sisters of Mercy. Accountability was also a significant issue in Castlebar Workhouse, as it was in all of the public institutions in Castlebar. We had a lot of reforming legislation introduced in the 19th century, but at Castlebar it wasn't well received. And whilst the legislation may have read well, it pretty much failed in terms of its implementation because it was frustrated by the Board of Guardians and also by the Mayo Grand Jury. Lucan had a long history of difficult dealings with the Poor Law Commissioners during the famine. And in 1863, when he wasn't getting his own way during the inquiries, he said at one of the Board of Guardian meetings that he was always opposed to the dictation of the commissioners. The last three items in that slide we will look at the end if we have some time. So the first inquiry, December 1862, complainant Mary Hard. If you remember, I mentioned she had just obtained a position as a nurse in the Beaver Hospital. And in November 1862, he brought forward a complaint that Dr. John Carter Barrett had criminal sexual intercourse with her at the workhouse and gave her money, and that she became pregnant. Separately, she alleged that Barrett was in the habit of turning up at the workhouse under the influence of alcohol and was intoxicated and drunk. The documentation and the records that we have do not go into detail in terms of what was meant by criminal sexual intercourse. Was it, on the one hand, non-consensual and therefore rape, or was it, on the other hand, Carter taking advantage of the situation, getting involved in abuse of his position, sexual misconduct, professional misconduct, that kind of thing. We just don't know, and it really was not explored. There was no criminal investigation by the police or by the magistrate. Poor law inspector appointed by the commissioners was Dr. Benjamin Brodie. He had conducted inspection in the Castlebar Workhouse before, including an investigation that resulted or marked the end of the line for Anthony French, the master. The women, or sorry, Mary Howard had no lawyers, so Heaney Father Heaney acted as her advocate. Witnesses, not clear if Barrett actually gave evidence. And it's probably worth mentioning that while we have an exceptionally detailed transcript of the second inquiry, we don't have that for the Howard inquiry. What we have are the decisions of the Poor Law Commissioners. We have the minutes of the Poor Law Guardians and extracts of those minutes, and a lot of correspondence, but not the cross-examination of witnesses or examination of witnesses at the inquiry itself. The inquiry, really the focus of it became Howard's character and lack of morality. The commissioners dismissed as altogether unsubstantiated and unworthy of credit her allegation of sexual misconduct by Carter. The commissioners concluded that Howard led an abandoned life and had 4 illegitimate children. The clear implication from the decision of the commissioners was that in light of Howard's the fact that she was an aged woman, in light of the fact that she had a physical disability, in light of the fact that she had a history of prostitution, that there was no way in the world that an upstanding professional gentleman of society like Dr. Barrett could have engaged in the type of activity that she said he did. What's really interesting is that no connection was made between that activity and the allegation of Barrett being intoxicated while in the workhouse. And this is remarkable because he was actually, that allegation and that complaint was upheld. And it was upheld because Howard's allegation was corroborated by others, including the workhouse porter, William Flynn, and 2 of the guardians, one of them, Hugh Brown. So in that context, Brown brought the guardians' attention to the fact that when the workhouse dispensary had burnt down some years earlier, it had crossed his mind that Barrett may have been intoxicated. And he pursued that at the time, but he could not get any answers. But while the guardians, or some of the guardians, and the commissioners easily came to a conclusion that there was a connection between Barrett's intoxication and the burning down of the dispensary, they completely failed to look at the possibility that there was a connection between his intoxication and the misconduct, the sexual misconduct that Mary Howard had alleged. It was utterly passed over. So the consequences or the outcome of all of this, Poor Law Commissioners instructed the guardians to remove Barrett. Barrett cleverly resigned because had he not resigned and been dismissed, he would not have been able to apply for a position with a public institution in the future. The guardians then advertised and the guardians, I should say, the majority of the guardians were very much against Barrett's resignation. Lucan felt that the charge of intoxication was not made out. He wanted another investigation. Some of the guardians wanted a parliamentary inquiry. But in any case, the guardians reluctantly accepted the resignation and advertised the position. There were several applications, including one from Barrett. The guardians, led by Bingham, colluded with the medical profession to ensure that many of the applicants withdrew before the meeting. And the long and short of it was that Barrett was reappointed to the position of medical officer at Castlebar Workhouse. And a minute of that appointment was sent to Dublin. When the Poor Law Commissioners received this, they were extremely unhappy, and they issued a legal order removing Barrett, which was received by the guardians late March, early April 1863. And then Barrett was reluctantly replaced by the Guardians by Dr. Miles Jordan, who himself had stood aside earlier to allow for Barrett to be reappointed. Later in 1863, Barrett was arrested and charged with fraud. He was also the register for births, deaths, and marriages in Castlebar, and it was noticed by the authorities that there was a massive surge in entries in the register. And when they investigated it, they found that Barrett had been making fictitious entries. He was paid on the basis of each entry. So the numbers of births, deaths, and marriages started to grow at an alarming rate. Barrett spent the winter of 1863 in prison. At the spring assizes of 1864, he was convicted of fraud and imprisonment, and a few months later, the Medical Council struck him off the register of medical practitioners. So the second inquiry took place in May 1863. This was a much more involved affair. There were a lot more evidence, a lot more witnesses, etc. Just breaking it down, there were two parts to this inquiry. Part A involved complainants Alan Burke and Biddy Cunningham. Part B involved complainants master and matron of the workhouse. So the allegations in Part A came from three different places. They came from Burke and Cunningham working together. They came from Burke and Cunningham individually, and then separately, there were a number of allegations that emerged from evidence given by others, people like Mary Kilcoyne. But for ease of reference here, I bunched them all together. So the first and principal complaint by Burke and Cunningham was that they were unjustifiably detained in the reformatory. So they arrived back in outside Castlebar Workhouse in the early autumn of 1862. When they arrived at the workhouse, they found that there was a new master, Patrick Callahan. Callahan had consulted with Mary Monclair. There were no women at that time in the reformatory, and Callahan felt that it was his duty to put characters such as Burke and Cunningham into the reformatory. So he made their admission to the workhouse conditional on them accepting that they would be in the reformatory, and they agreed. They behaved very badly when they were admitted, and their reason for that was they felt that there was no current infraction that he was justified in using against them, and they rebelled against that. Cunningham made a separate allegation that she had been given substandard clothing. Both alleged that they were forced to wash laundry for persons in Castlebar, and specifically the Bowl family and John Bowl. There was allegations that water was withheld in the reformatory. They were forced to drink from puddles on the floor of the reformatory. There was an allegation that Oprah Mary McHale had died due to negligence, that she had not been looked after, she had been not been given care, she didn't have any heat, and was left for hours in the infirmary unattended. On Christmas Eve 1862, Patrick Callahan was unhappy with the conduct of the schoolboys. They were singing in their dormitory, so he took a whip to the dormitory, closed the door, and in his own words, dealt with the boys in the reformatory. Many of them suffered severe blisters. One boy by the name of Golden was taken to hospital. The rules allowed for punishment and corporal punishment, but not in the manner that Callahan had doled it out on Christmas Eve. And then there were a number of allegations against matron Monclair of using workhouse beds to raise money where she was renting them out during the assizes. So the complaints made by the master and the matron were firstly that Father Heaney had assaulted Protestant inmate Margaret McDonough 2 years earlier. He had done that, he admitted to doing that. He had arrived in the workhouse and went to the female part of the workhouse without an officer. That was his first mistake. He walked in on an altercation in the dormitory. These facts weren't disputed. There was an altercation over a bolster. Heaney shouted at everybody to be quiet. McDermott refused. He struck her on the side of the face with the back of his hand, apologised. It was brought to the attention of Monclair, and she did nothing about it. The second allegation against Feeney was a more general one, that he was interfering in the management of the workhouse. Monclair and Callahan wanted Heaney out of the workhouse, and these allegations, it was alleged or said, were raised by Callahan and Moncler to deflect from the long list of allegations made by by Burke, Cunningham, and others against them. Again, the inspector was Brodie. The women had no lawyers. Moncler, however, took legal advice and had advice from counsel, and she had a specific concern that we will get onto. There were many witnesses. When the inquiry opened, there was an exceptionally disproportionate emphasis on the character and lack of morality of the female complainants. John Bold was allowed to examine them extensively, cross-examine them aggressively and extensively. He was allowed to table their long history of problems with the authorities, allegations of prostitution, rumors of intimacy with other men that they were not married to, rumors of pregnancy, illegitimate children. He obtained their prison records from Davis Young, governor of the prison, and put them on the table in the inquiry, and other long lists of offences they had been charged with and convicted of. So the outcomes, the allegations made by Burke and Cunningham were unfounded. Master and matron had acted out of a sense of duty when they confined the women to the reformatory. Cunningham and Burke were notorious characters. They could not be allowed to mix with virtuous and well-disposed women. The allegation that Mary McHale died of neglect was unfounded. The allegation that Bowles' laundry was washed in the workhouse was unfounded. If there's any sense of fun or amusement to be taken from any of this grim and awful stuff, it is the aspects relating to John Bowles' socks and underwear. Every time they were mentioned during the day of the inquiry, you can feel Bowles' sense of dismay, discomfort, and horror as he was constantly putting out fires to try and deal with this evidence. And even those who were called to give evidence that supported his position slipped up and were inconsistent in their evidence. It was found that Matron Moncler had not disposed of union property. The bed that she was renting during the assizes for money was in fact her own. Father Heaney should not have entered the female section without an officer. I should not have struck Mary McDermott. Heaney was interfering in the management of the workhouse, and essentially the conclusion was reached, or a determination was made that Heaney had to be removed from the workhouse. So it was a victory for the officers, but the issue really was this rebellion put down? Patrick Callahan undoubtedly had an explicit mandate from the Guardians, or a majority of the Guardians, and I keep saying majority of the Guardians because some of them did not agree with the approach. He had an explicit mandate from the Guardians, from the Poor Law Commission, to support his approach to dealing with insubordination at the workhouse. But fortunately for us and unfortunately for Callahan, he relied too much on this and probably displayed far too much in his enthusiasm in the days and weeks that followed the closing of this inquiry. So in late June 1863, Ellen Burke and, sorry, that should say Cunningham, not Callahan, Burke and Cunningham decided they had enough of the workhouse. They stole some blankets and they were imprisoned at the jail on the Westward Road for 6 months. So they escaped the wrath of the matron and master when they returned to the workhouse. Michael Gary and Thomas Halligan were not so lucky. They were also involved in the second inquiry as witnesses, and there's a very involved story around them as well, which I don't intend to go into in detail. Gary was partially blind, Halligan was lame. They're both in their early 20s. They were brought before magistrates Andrew Stritch and Hugh Brown for assaulting Callahan. Essentially, they had gathered outside the boardroom of the workhouse. They expected to be brought in before the Guardians by Callahan, who had accused them of stealing some cabbages. They weren't brought in, so they took a wander to the porter's lodge. The porter at the time was Francis Carson. Carson told them to return to the workhouse. For whatever reason, they did not. Later, Callahan appeared, told them to return. They were either too slow in doing so or did not do so. So Callahan took Halligan's walking stick and beat him with it. Halligan retaliated and kicked Callahan, and hence the assault case. Church was very supportive of Halligan's and Gary's case. He refused to allow the case for assault to proceed because Callahan had struck the first blow. But Hugh Brown was the other magistrate, and he, being a guardian, took a very different view. Halligan and Gary were imprisoned for insubordination for 1 month. Shortly after that, Callahan had Mary Kilcoyne put in the reformatory for being abusive, and meeting a married man named Corcoran. Don't know if it's the same Corcoran as I mentioned earlier on. There were suggestions here that they were again intimate, and that was the reason given for putting her in the reformatory. Kilcoyne's response to being put in the reformatory was absolute. She broke 110 panes of glass and ended up before the Board of Guardians. And then in August 1863, a very important case came before magistrates, again Andrew Strach and Hugh Brown. And this case was really the final engagement in this lengthy war between the paupers and the women and the Board of Guardians. And the outcome of this case would really determine whether Patrick Callahan would continue as master of the workhouse and whether this regime of suppression would be allowed to continue. The facts of the case are pretty brutal and difficult to convey in this summary fashion, but Bridget Martin found herself in the dining hall just before a meal was served. She was served potatoes, which she found uncooked, too hard to eat. So she complained to Callahan. Callahan told her to shut up, which unfortunately for her she didn't do. And in his hand he had a very large key, and he struck Bridget Martin across the head with his hand with the key in his palm, and that knocked her to the floor. He took her by the hair and dragged her from the dining room to the reformatory, pulling out a clump of hair as he did so, and left her in the reformatory. She was later released. I'm not sure how long it took for her to be released, but when she was released, she told him that she intended to bring a case before the Castlebar Board of Guardians. He immediately struck her, knocked her to the floor, put his knees on her chest, and called for Porter Francis Carson to drag her to the workhouse, to the workhouse reformatory. When they got to the door of the reformatory, Martin managed to grab the door with her hands. She was kicked in the shin by Callahan, and that left a mark on her leg, and she struck on the hands with some form of rod so that she would release the door. When the case came before the Magistrate Strach was clearly of the view that Callahan was guilty of assault. The workhouse rules allowed for punishment, but it did not allow for Callahan to kick Martin. But unfortunately, Hugh Brown was not of the same view, so there was deadlock, and the case was adjourned for a week. And during that week, a number of steps were taken locally to ensure that the results the following week favoured the master and favoured the guardians. An additional magistrate was added to the panel, Charles Lionel Fitzgerald. There was an immediate suggestion that he would be biased because he was also a magistrate. And he dealt with that at the opening of the hearing by saying that he always felt that it was his duty as a magistrate and a guardian to look after the interests of the destitute and the poor. But as a guardian, he had an equal duty to protect the officers of the workhouse who had a very difficult job to do. The magistrates couldn't agree, so Assistance was sought from the legal advisor at Dublin Castle, and he issued a very simple response that really didn't get into any legal analysis of the rules or application of the rules to the facts. He simply said that the master had acted within the workhouse rules, and the case against Callahan was dismissed. John Bull celebrated by going after Andrew Stritch in the Mayo Constitution in a pretty despicable and horrible fashion. Throughout the legal cases, he also went after Bridget Martin in the press, and referring to her as a heroine and as a celebrity and other horrible things. So analysis and conclusions, and I know we're really short on time, so I'm going to press through these very quickly. So it is really impossible to see how the women of the reformatory could have succeeded in the inquiries on the basis of their testimony alone. The examination of every complaint focused on the character and morality of the victims and the witnesses, and the inquiries descended into a struggle between what were defined or described as loose women on the one hand, and upstanding men and virtuous women on the other. In the credibility stakes, different standards were applied. During the first inquiry, Mary McClare gave evidence on oath that she, in her long tenure as matron, had never seen Dr. Barrett intoxicated in the workhouse. There was shock visible on the faces of many at the inquiry when she said that, and she afterwards realized that she was in some difficulty because she had perjured herself. But notwithstanding that, and notwithstanding that was revealed clearly at the second inquiry, it in no way went to discredit her evidence at the second inquiry, and no case was taken against her for perjury. Barrett's drunkenness at the workhouse was, as I've already said, not a relevant factor in the sexual misconduct case. And Callahan, the master, was shown in cross-examination to have lied on several occasions, and he was also shown to have breached the workhouse rules, and that view was shared by Andrew Stritch, who was the most independent of the magistrates looking at these cases. The language of the guardians, the officers and the lawyers and the magistrates is also really, really interesting. And if you look at the language, you can see that the words were always very carefully chosen. And if there wasn't coaching involved, there was certainly a way of dealing with these women. So when every time the women were mentioned, when they were cross-examined and questioned, they were always referred to as fallen women, bad characters, loose women, illegitimate children were brought up, prostitution was brought up, etc., etc. And the best example of that can be found in a question that was put to Master Patrick Callahan. He was asked whether he thought Mary McHale had died in the workhouse from neglect. Now, he could have responded by saying no. He could have responded by saying Mary McHale did not die from neglect, but he didn't say either of those things. He said Mary McHale was a woman of bad character, and she did not die from neglect. Witnesses were clearly intimidated. They lied on oath, and they were afraid. And you couldn't blame them because many of them had nowhere else to go but the workhouse once the inquiry was concluded. And many of them held roles within the workhouse as wards, women, etc. John Bull's laundry and the laundry of the Bull family was more likely than not washed in the workhouse. The guardians colluded in the reappointment of Barrett. They colluded to ensure that an effective master was appointed and kept his position. The Lucan influence was everywhere. There were many conflicts of interest evident. I mentioned already the guardians also being magistrates. John Bull himself was a guardian, so he had a statutory responsibility to protect the paupers in the workhouse. He was the nephew of the matron, but she was accountable to him. He was a newspaper proprietor and a private citizen who, although no allegations were made against him, he felt that he had to clear his name and use the inquiry to achieve that purpose. The conduct of the inquiries leaves so much to be desired. As I said, Bull was allowed to hijack the inquiry second inquiry to clear his name. The women had no legal representation. In the Martin case, when Bridget Martin turned up with both a solicitor and a barrister, counsel for Patrick Callan, George O'Malley, absolutely savaged Martin when she was giving evidence. He wants to know how she could hold out her hand and say she was destitute and look for assistance from Castlebar Union, and then with the other hand, hand out money to expensive lawyers to defend her. In his view, women like Martin should not have had legal representation. The system would collapse if they did. He also pursued a line of questioning to show that Martin had been beaten by her estranged husband. Magistrate Stritch managed to terminate that line of inquiry, but in the round, his support for her did not deliver a good result for her. So the death of Frederick Cavendish, the founder and proprietor of the Connaught Telegraph in the late 1850s, left John Bowl and the Mayo Constitution in control of the narrative around the poor and the disenfranchised in Castlebar. And the poor would not, and the disenfranchised would not get a voice again until James Daly arrived on the scene some years later. Callahan became the longest serving master at Castlebar Workhouse. He died in his apartment in the workhouse in 1900, and the obituaries were kind to him. McClare left the workhouse in 1871. Bull died in 1868 at the age of 49, and the women of the reformatory stepped back into obscurity until 2 or 3 years ago when I tripped over them in the boardroom of the jail on the Westwood Road. The history of Castlebar Workhouse is often painted with very broad and sweeping brushstrokes, and I believe it's now time that we start to engage with the detail. Later this year, I'll be publishing a collection of essays under the title of Criminal Conversation with My Wife. This collection will use examples exclusively from Mayo, and will include, amongst other topics, the position of women when they encounter the legal system as a plaintiff, a defendant, or otherwise. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. I'm now going to open the Q&A. If you want to ask a question, then you need to use the tab that enables you to raise your hand. I will then allow you to go live and ask your question, and hopefully I'll be able to deal with it. We'll try and deal with as many questions as we can in the time available to us. So who would like to ask the first question? So Avril Stanton, no, sorry, Anne Jordan, I think I have one for you. Sorry, Anne, I'm just trying to unmute you. So I've just moved on to Avril Stanton. I wasn't able to make a connection with Anne. Avril, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to know, Michael, thank you first of all for a fascinating lecture. I really enjoyed every moment. Do any of the punishment books exist from any of the workhouses in Ireland?
That's a really good question, and I spent a good bit of time looking for the answer to that. I was unable to find the answer for Castlebar. I believe it doesn't exist, but it is possible to retrospectively reconstruct it, because if you go through minutes that have survived in correspondence, you can see what the punishments were, and then you can make an assumption that they were recorded in many cases in the book. However, the Donegal County Council have an amazing website, and they have put on it many of the records they have, including extracts from their punishment book. And on one of the earlier slides, I've put up a link to that website so you can see what the punishment book looked like.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, so now I'm going to try and move on to Seamus Birmingham. Seamus, are you still there? Hello, Seamus.
Okay, am I on now?
You're on now, indeed, Seamus. Go ahead.
Yeah, just on the workhouse itself in Castlebar, before it was demolished, when did it cease to be a workhouse and when did it become a county home?
I don't have the precise answers for that, Seamus. In the 1920s, they were looking at changing its nature and function. So I think it became a county home sometime in the 1920s, 1930s. I'll send you on the specific answer to it because it's easy to get. I just haven't focused on it in the context of this.
No, because when it was a county home, I do remember as a child in the 50s, going in there for some reason. I don't know who we were there. I was with my mother, all right, and she was visiting somebody. And went upstairs. It was in the women's ward. And I'll give you an idea at the time. It was the mid-50s. I was born in 1947, so I was very young at the time. But I remember going in there and looking up at the roof, the ceiling inside, and you could just see the rafters and the bare slates. So that's the kind of a ceiling it was, and there were all iron beds down each wall on it. And above at the end on one wall, it must be some lady that was there that had a bit of money or something, because her bed was done up with a canopy over it, white lace coming down from the wall. I just said I'd give you that opinion, what I saw of it.
No, that's really helpful, Seamus. And I think what you've raised a really important point. I think it would be really important for people doing research like this to sit down with you and other people in Castlebar who were in that building before it was demolished, and to sit down with the plans, the template plans that exist for other workhouses, and mark those plans up with the benefit of the knowledge that you guys have, because not that we're encouraging your demise, but ultimately in the next generation, when we don't have the benefit of that knowledge, this will be lost forever. And I think a lot of gaps could really helpfully be allowed to, could be really helpfully filled with that kind of engagement.
Yeah, thanks, Michael.
Okay, I'm moving on to John McAlin. Hello, John, can you hear me? John, I think, is gone.
No, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, John. Go ahead.
Good, good. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for all the research you did on this, and it brought back a lot of memories to me, because as a youngster, we had a shop in Castlebar, and I regularly visited the county home, where we used to supply them with dry goods, to me, it was always a very eerie place, and the doorway, we seemed to go down there in the evening. I can only remember winter evenings, and it always seemed very eerie and very foreboding. But I have memories of it. And in the 60s, the other connection that I have with the county home, my uncles were the contractors that built the new county home in the 60s. And coincidentally, another uncle was the architect of the new county home. So that was my connection with the whole thing. And the other thing I saw, Mary McAlin was there in the 1863. I think she was she in the laundry or whatever. I was just wondering, would I have any connection with her? But I just want to thank you again. I just thank you again. Thanks, Michael.
No worries. Well, there's a good bit of detail on that Mary McAlin, and where she came from, and where she worked before she came to the workhouse. And she was the laundry assistant. She gave evidence at the inquiry, and I'm pleased to say, John, that she did not perjure herself, and that her evidence was pretty. I think it was probably pretty useless to all parties involved, which I think is probably the best one we can expect in these kind of circumstances.
Well, when this COVID goes, we'll meet and talk more about it.
So Martin Corcoran, you're the next person I can see on my list. Can you hear me, Martin?
Hello, Michael.
Hello, Martin.
How are you? Thanks very much for a very good presentation. Really enjoyed that. Very insightful. Just a question on, do you have a figure on how many people died in that particular premises during the 1800s? And were they all buried on site, or were they buried elsewhere?
And there are so many questions around deaths in the workhouse, and I think that answering it in a sort of a global way in terms of the period of its operation, I think that will forever be a very difficult thing. I mean, obviously, when deaths were registered, those deaths in the workhouse would have been registered as workhouse deaths. So, you know, from whenever civil registration of deaths started in 1864 or whenever it was, you know, we should, if we wanted to go looking for those deaths, be able to find those, although it would be a very difficult thing to do. A separate project I'm involved in is a thing called a Mayo Famine Deaths Database, where there's an objective over the next 3 to 5 years to build a database of as many known and unknown deaths in the workhouse in the period, in the famine periods. And famine period for this exercise will probably start in August 1846 and end sometime in the end of or the middle of 1851, to be determined. You know, at this point in time, I wouldn't even start to begin by telling you what my thoughts on the number are. It's very high. The majority were buried in the grounds of the workhouse. What happened to the remains of those poor people? What happened to the remains of those poor people once the workhouse ceased to be a workhouse and works and construction was done? I don't know.
People dying, new deaths. So the bulge is cut.
So sorry, I'm not sure if we had some interference there. So
the government seems to come in there.
The answer, I think, to the question, Martin, is I don't know the answer right now. We may never know the answer, but I would hope in maybe 3 years' time to be here telling you guys what my view is, having reviewed, you know, every possible source that I can find and talk to as many people as possible. And so
that'd be interesting, because of course there's a lot of young people buried there as well on site. Just in relation to the Mr. Halligan that was referenced in the presentation, do you know anything about him? It's just that we might have a family connection there. We're just unsure.
Harrigan, was he one of the guardians?
I think
Thomas Halligan.
Thomas Halligan.
Oh, Thomas Halligan. Okay, so yeah, Thomas Halligan was one of the unfortunate individuals in the workhouse at that time, and he features in and gives evidence
Crisis, which includes
in a number of the inquiries. There was a separate family in the workhouse at that time by the name of Halligan, and they were a Protestant family, a woman and her children, and they were one of the families brought forward by the Reverend Stoney to give evidence that they had been abused by Catholic.
The Vice President and her husband.
Yeah, we're getting some interference, I think, from somewhere. So what I'll do is pass on what I have to you, and if you want to explore those connections further, then you'll have some information to do that with.
Thanks very much, Michael. Thanks again. Great presentation.
Michael Keane, you're next on the list.
Hello, Michael. Thanks very much for your lecture. It was absolutely fascinating, riveting, and absorbing. And you did so much research. I congratulate you on it. I was telling you there was a similar incident in the Claremorris workhouse that I researched a little bit, where the master was charged with procuring ladies for prostitution by the local parish priest. I think it was Monsignor. And he charged him and wrote a letter to the board charging him with this crime. And I think that he was afterwards
I couldn't see him, you see.
It went to court. Now, I didn't follow it up on the papers, but just when I read the terms like nurse that you explained,
I noticed he didn't offer me the.
I'm getting a lot of interference here.
Yeah, we're getting interference. I think somebody may have.
You're all right. It doesn't matter.
The news channel.
The Claremorris Workhouse probably closed in the probably 1980 after that, and the British Army took it over and did a lot of damage. I think that's
he'll
pay
never be able to
compensation.
do a talking.
I leave it at that, Mike. Thanks very much again. There's a lot of
Thanks, Mark. I mean, there are many cases like this.
No,
I think a case that is worthy of specific investigation is the murder charge brought against the master of Ballarnewey Workhouse during the famine. That was a particularly terrible case where the body of a child was buried in such a way that an autopsy could not be conducted. So there were lots of inquiries like this, lots of allegations that went far beyond the type of things that I've been looking at in Castlebar. Brian Hoban, I'm going to try and open up a line for you now. Just give me a moment. Okay, Brian, are you there?
Hello.
Hello, Brian.
Hello, Michael. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very informative. Just a few comments or queries or whatever. The first would be a personal connection, I suppose, with the workhouse. An uncle of mine died in the old workhouse sometime in the early 1960s. And his comment on the time, he had been in Maryland Park Hospital, he had been in the Bob Secure in Tuam and the General Hospital. So of all the hospitals he was in, the best care he got was in the Castlebar Workhouse. And I distinctly remember visiting him there with my father. Another thing, before the old county home ceased to be, Castlebar Boxing Club organised a collection around the shops in Castlebar at the time and went down on St. Stephen's Day with a group of traditional musicians and visited all the wards. And presentations were made to some of the inmates or whatever, maybe announcing drug tobacco or whatever. Tom McHugh, I know, was involved in it. And Paddy Hawk, and there were quite a few of the local people in the town. The other thing I remember as a young lad, playing in the vicinity of the old burial grounds. Myself and a friend of mine, James Cahill, who's a solicitor in Castlebar, came across quite a number of bones and skulls and whatever while playing in the grounds and whatever there. The query I would like to know, when the new Sacred Heart home was built, I understand the burials or whatever, that they were reinterred. I'm wondering, was there any documentation of the number of bodies that were reinterred or where they were reinterred or whatever? So that's just all my bit of query and a bit of commentary. Thanks again.
No, that's very helpful, Brian. And I think along with Seamus and some of the other people who have spoken, and indeed James Cahill, I think we need to get all you guys into the room and get a recording or a note of all these experiences. I've not looked at what happened when the workhouse was demolished and the new county home built. Right now, my world is very much the sort of the Georgian and Victorian world of Castlebar. Maybe at some stage in the future, it is something that I will look at. But I think that if I take one thing away from tonight, maybe there is a need for somebody to create some sort of a template document where it could be given to people like yourself and Seamus and other people who are willing to just, write down and preserve this narrative that you have, and that we could then centrally keep it for posterity and for research. Maybe the places in Castlebar in the library or somewhere like that. But I do think that we have learned so much about losing our history because it hasn't been recorded, that perhaps we should start to be much more deliberate in our endeavours to preserve this living history that we have right now. I don't appear to have any further questions. Oh, okay, hang on, Carmel McAvey. Did I just see your hand get raised there? Let me just see. Perhaps not. So look, I want to thank everybody sincerely for tuning in this evening. It really makes it worthwhile when there's interest in the stuff that you're looking at. Next month, we'll be going back to the jail on the Green in Castlebar to look at what it was like for women and men on the day of the Battle of Castlebar and in the weeks that followed. And then the following month, I'm planning to look at a woman who I've discovered in Castlebar who is fast becoming an absolute hero of mine. I'm not going to say what her name was. She lived for a time on the Mall, and she was an opera singer. She lived for a time in Newtown and for a time on Ellison Street. And she, in the early 20th century, took on the system, took on the law, took on her family, and had a resounding success in the forecourts in Dublin. And her story is so worthy of telling. So we'll be returning to that probably in early March. So thank you so much for joining, and good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night. Thank you.
Nice.
Thanks very much, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael.